They tried to bury this story for 200 years, court records sealed in dust, church whispers smothered behind stained glass, and a family name quietly erased from polite conversation. But paper has a way of surviving the grave, and when those files were pried open, when the ink bled back into daylight, the truth that came crawling out was never meant for mortal ears. What you're about to hear is dangerous, because once you know it, you cannot unknow it. It began in Henrico County, Virginia, in the autumn of 1784. A land still tasting of revolution, its air thick with the scent of tobacco and ambition. In those days, power didn't shout. It spoke in low voices over mahogany desks, in contracts signed under candlelight, in alliances cemented by marriage beds and bloodlines. And among the silent kings of this new America was a man named Jonathan Caldwell, a name you will remember long after this story is over. To his neighbors, Caldwell was a pillar, wealthy, devout, refined. His estate, Mill Haven, sprawled across 3,000 acres, every blade of grass trimmed by enslaved hands, every stone in the great house placed to remind visitors that here lived permanence. Men shook his hand like they were touching the bedrock of Virginia itself. Women lowered their eyes as he passed, sensing something in him, an authority that was not requested but demanded. But behind the closed doors of Mill Haven, Caldwell lived by a creed far older than the Republic, a creed passed to him in brittle letters from a dead grandfather: keep the name, keep the land, at all costs. He had no son, no heir, and to a man like Jonathan Caldwell, that was not misfortune. It was an existential threat. The kind of threat that makes men consider things they would never confess. On a night when the November rain beat against the windows like skeletal fingers, fate, or something darker, arrived at Caldwell's gates. A carriage overturned near a bend in the road they called Devil's Elbow. A driver dead, a man and a woman, both broken by the fall, and a child, a girl of perhaps 11, thrown clear into the bushes, alive only because she'd landed among the brambles. Her name was Elizabeth Hartwell, and when Jonathan saw her standing in the firelight in a borrowed gown, her hair washed and drying by the hearth, he felt the breath catch in his throat. She bore a startling resemblance to his late wife, Catherine, the same eyes, the same delicate jaw, the same chestnut hair. He asked her questions with a voice soft enough to pass for kindness. She answered with the refined diction of a child raised among quality. She spoke of an uncle named Thomas, of parents who would surely come for her. But Jonathan already knew they would not. That night, while the girl slept in his grandmother's bed, Jonathan descended into the wine cellar with his overseer, a man whose loyalty had long been tested and proven. In the damp dark, among the casks and shadows, they discussed what must and must not be said, the documents that would never leave his desk, the letters that would never be sent. Elizabeth's life, as she knew it, ended the moment her carriage shattered on that road, and her new life, the one designed for her without her consent, began under the roof of Mill Haven. Understand this. Jonathan Caldwell was not a man who believed in accidents. Elizabeth Hartwell never returned to the road where her parents died. Jonathan saw to that. He understood that grief untended might find its own way back to the truth, and truth was the one thing that could ruin him. So the first rule he wrote for her life was simple. Mill Haven was her world now. From the outside, his actions looked noble. In the weeks after the accident, neighbors saw the respected widower take in a fragile orphan, feed her, clothe her, shield her from the harsher winds of fate. But what they didn't see was the precision with which he arranged her future. Jonathan wasn't simply offering shelter, he was claiming her. It began with a forged letter. The ink, deliberately smudged in places, told of a distant Uncle Thomas, the very one Elizabeth had asked for on the night she arrived, struck down by fever somewhere beyond the Kentucky hills. The timing was perfect, so perfect it could have been drawn by the hand of Providence itself, if Providence had a taste for fraud. The county clerk, already drowning in post-war paperwork, accepted Jonathan's guardianship petition without question. And why wouldn't he? This was Jonathan Caldwell, one of the wealthiest men in Henrico, a man whose word carried the weight of gold. And so it was done. Officially, legally, irrevocably, Elizabeth Hartwell was now Jonathan's ward, bound to him not by blood, but by law, which in this country was often the stronger chain. But Jonathan understood that paper alone wasn't enough. Paper was for the courts. Control was for the mind. From the moment the adoption was sealed, he began shaping her environment with the care of a gardener pruning a rare and dangerous plant. Every book she read was chosen by him. Every letter she sent was dictated, copied, and reviewed before posting. Visitors were few, carefully selected, and never left her side long enough to whisper a verse on of the world he didn't approve. Isolation is a quiet kind of violence. You don't notice its knife until you realize how small the room has become. Jonathan dressed her in silks and satins, fed her delicacies from the city, gave her music lessons and tutors from Richmond's finest families. To Elizabeth, it felt like fortune had rescued her from ruin. To Jonathan, it was a transaction. He was trading comfort for obedience, gratitude for silence, and in that silence, he planted the seeds of something far more ambitious. He took her to Sunday service at the local church, where he made sure the congregation saw him as a man fulfilling his Christian duty. He spoke in low tones with the minister about her delicate constitution and need for moral guidance, establishing a story the community would accept without probing. In the eyes of the county, Elizabeth Hartwell was being raised to be a lady under the firm but loving hand of her guardian. But in Jonathan's private mind, the mind that had learned to read both scripture and law as instruments of power, Elizabeth was something else entirely. She was not just an heir to be molded. She was a vessel, a way to ensure that the Caldwell name, Caldwell lands, and Caldwell blood remained untouched by outsiders. And the first step toward that goal had just been taken without a single voice raised in protest. She thought she had been saved. In truth, she had been acquired. Power doesn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it hides in signatures, in clauses buried 3 paragraphs deep, in ink that looks harmless until you understand its purpose. Jonathan Caldwell knew this better than any man in Virginia. By the winter after Elizabeth's arrival, the paperwork that made her his ward was already gathering dust in the county archives. But Jonathan wasn't a man who stopped at possession. Possession was temporary. Ownership was eternal. And for that he needed a document no one else would ever see. So he traveled to Richmond, not for tobacco contracts or court business, but for something far more delicate. His destination was the second-floor office of Cornelius Vance, a lawyer whose real specialty was not defending men in court, but keeping them out of it. Vance's rooms smelled of mahogany polish and old paper. The shelves were lined with leather-bound volumes of property law, inheritance cases, and marriage statutes. The machinery of power dressed as scholarship. Jonathan handed him a sheet of paper with a draft already written in his own hand. Vance read it without comment, his face as blank as a ledger. It was a marriage contract, but not like any he had seen. The groom was named Jonathan Caldwell of Mill Haven Estate. The bride was not. Instead, the language described her only as a young woman of proper breeding, education, and moral standing, to be determined at a future date. The timeline was left deliberately vague. The conditions were airtight. In other words, a legal snare, lying open until the day Jonathan decided to spring it. Vance did not ask questions. He understood the currency of silence. By the time Jonathan returned to Mill Haven, the contract was tucked away in Vance's private files, beyond the reach of clerks, courts, or curious neighbors. Back at the estate, Elizabeth's education took on a new intensity. She learned not just arithmetic and literature, but French for hosting diplomats, Latin for reading old legal texts, and the subtleties of Virginia's social code, which fork to lift first at a governor's table, how to read a man's station by the cut of his coat, how to hide her true opinion behind the mask of polite agreement. Jonathan's hand was everywhere. He guided her reading, sat in on her lessons, corrected her posture with the same attention he gave to the accounts ledger. He praised her when she displayed obedience, withdrew warmth when she questioned his instruction. It was not teaching, it was conditioning, and it worked. Neighbors began to remark how remarkably refined the girl had become under Jonathan's care. The minister noted her mature sense of duty for one so young, But what they saw as maturity was something else entirely, the slow replacement of her own thoughts with the ones he put there. Elizabeth still believed, at least then, that her guardian's every move was for her own good. She didn't know that in a desk drawer miles away lay a contract that named her future without her consent. Jonathan Caldwell wasn't just raising a ward, he was manufacturing a bride, and the day he chose to reveal that truth would not be a day she could refuse. For a time, Elizabeth mistook the weight in her chest for grief. She told herself the silences in Millhaven's long corridors were simply the echoes of absence, her parents' voices missing from the air. But grief doesn't sharpen like a knife. It doesn't whisper when you pass a locked door. It began with the glances. Jonathan's eyes, holding just a beat too long when she answered a question, the way his gaze would rest on her as she practiced the pianoforte, not with the distant pride of a guardian, but with a focus that made the skin on the back of her neck grow warm. He never touched her in a way she could call improper, not then, but there was a closeness in the air between them, an invisible cord drawn tighter each day, and Elizabeth was beginning to feel its pull. Miss Fenwick, her tutor, seemed to notice. Once, when Jonathan entered the schoolroom unexpectedly, Elizabeth saw Miss Fenwick's hand still mid-sentence on the slate, her jaw tightening ever so slightly, but no word was spoken. In Millhaven, silence was its own law. Her world was rich with luxuries, but narrow in scope. When she asked to visit the nearby village, Jonathan explained that the roads were too dangerous and a lady need not trouble herself with common markets. When she asked about her Uncle Thomas again, he would sigh, remind her gently of the fever that had taken him, then change the subject to her studies. And yet, little things refused to sit still in her mind. Once, when Jonathan was away in Richmond, she wandered further than usual in the house and found herself before the door of his study. It was locked, as it always was in his absence, but from inside came the faint scent of ink and sealing wax, recent, not weeks old. Someone had been in there, and not for bookkeeping. Another time, while gathering her sewing from the drawing room, she overheard Jonathan in quiet conversation on with Samuel Bigham, the overseer. Their words were muffled, but she caught her own name, followed by Jonathan's voice, low and deliberate. It must appear natural. No one is to suspect. When she entered, both men fell silent. Jonathan smiled and asked about her embroidery as though nothing had been said. It was these moments, small, fleeting but persistent, that began to thread together into something Elizabeth couldn't yet name. She felt watched, measured, not like a child under a guardian's protection, but like a prize in a glass case. At night, in the large canopy bed Jonathan had given her, she would lie awake listening to the old house settle in the darkness, the creak of timbers, the sigh of wind down the chimney, and sometimes footsteps in the hall, unhurried, deliberate, pausing outside her door. The door always remained closed, the footsteps always moved on, but each time she would hold her breath until they faded into the far end of the corridor. Jonathan never said or did anything that could be called openly threatening, and yet Elizabeth was beginning to understand something men learn in battlefields and women learn in locked rooms. Danger often smiles before it strikes. She did not yet know the shape of the trap around her, but she was starting to hear the sound of it tightening. The tests began so quietly that Elizabeth didn't realize they were tests at all. One evening, Jonathan asked her to sit in the study while he reviewed plantation accounts. The room smelled of tobacco and candle wax, the heavy walnut desk between them piled with ledgers. He slid one toward her, opened to a column of figures, and told her to check the totals. It was a simple task, except that one of the entries was wrong. She hesitated, pencil in hand. Was she to correct it, or leave it as it stood? When she finally pointed out the error, Jonathan's eyes lingered on her face for a long, unreadable moment before he smiled and said, "Good. Accuracy above all things." The next week, he asked her to write a letter on his behalf to a merchant in Philadelphia. The dictation was precise, every word chosen, and when she signed his name in her careful script, he didn't thank her. He simply nodded, folded the letter, and sealed it without another glance. She didn't know then that the merchant was fictitious, the letter never sent. The point wasn't correspondence, the point was obedience. Over the months, the requests grew stranger. He asked her to repeat conversations they'd had days earlier, word for word, to describe what she'd been wearing the last time they dined in Richmond, to recall in exact order the names of every guest who'd visited Millhaven in the past year. It was as if he were testing not her memory, but her willingness to be examined. And always there was praise when she pleased him, a subtle cooling of his manner when she did not. But the most telling trial came one summer afternoon when Jonathan took her riding through the far fields. The sun was high, the air thick with the smell of cut hay, and in the distance Elizabeth saw a man she recognized, an old acquaintance of her father's, Mr. Albright, dismounting near the edge of the property. She lifted a hand to wave, but Jonathan's voice cut the gesture short. "Do not speak to him," he said, the tone soft but carrying something unmistakable underneath. "Mr. Albright's affairs are complicated. Not a man you should be seen conversing with." They rode past without stopping. That evening, Jonathan made a point of asking whether she had followed his instruction. When she said yes, his smile carried that rare warmth that felt like sunlight after a long storm. It dawned on her later, perhaps days later, that he hadn't been testing her safety. He had been testing her loyalty, measuring whether his word alone was enough to override her own judgment. The answer on that day had been yes. And Jonathan Caldwell understood something dangerous. The girl who obeys you against her own instincts is no longer merely your ward. She is becoming your creation. Jonathan Caldwell understood a truth that tyrants and priests alike have long known. Control the frame through which someone sees the world, and you control the choices they believe are possible. By the time Elizabeth reached her 15th year, the tests had become less about obedience in the moment and more about the ideas she carried into her private thoughts. Jonathan began to curate her reality. At the breakfast table, he would share stories from the county court, each one framed as a lesson. The neighbor whose fortune was lost because he trusted the wrong people, the widow who remarried and saw her late husband's estate carved apart by her new husband's kin. The moral was always the same: outsiders could not be trusted, and family, true family, was the only fortress worth defending. In the evenings, he would read aloud from scripture, but his selections were deliberate. Verses on obedience, on the sanctity of vows, on the duty of a woman to her protector. He spoke of these not as abstract teachings, but as truths written into the order of the world, as natural as the rising sun. Elizabeth found herself repeating these lessons in her own mind, using them to measure her decisions. When she faltered in a task, she would ask herself not what is right, but what would please him. Jonathan also controlled what she didn't know. Newspapers from Richmond arrived each week, but he removed certain pages before she saw them. Letters from old acquaintances of her parents were intercepted and misplaced. Even her tutor, Miss Fenwick, was gently but firmly reminded not to fill the girl's head with modern ideas about female independence or unnecessary travel. In place of these absent voices, Jonathan filled her hours with estate work. He taught her how to manage inventories, negotiate tobacco sales, and calculate harvest yields. At first, she was proud of these lessons. They made her feel capable, important. But the work was never truly hers. It was practice for a role she didn't yet know she had been cast to play. One evening, as they walked the garden path, Jonathan gestured to the rows of roses and said, "Do you know why these bloom so well, Elizabeth? Because they are pruned. Left to themselves, they grow wild, tangled, and weak, but shaped, directed, they flourish." She nodded, sensing the metaphor was meant for her, though she could not bring herself to ask what form he intended her to take. Jonathan didn't need her to ask. He could see it in her eyes, the slow erosion of resistance, the quiet acceptance of his definitions of safety, loyalty, and love. By controlling what she saw, what she heard, and what she believed was possible, Jonathan Caldwell was no longer merely raising a ward. He was authoring the story of her life, and in his version, there would be no chapter she wrote herself. It came on a rain-slick afternoon in late autumn, when the sky pressed low over Millhaven, and the air smelled of wet earth and chimney smoke. Elizabeth was in the drawing room, bent over a book of French verse when the sound of hooves echoed up the drive. Visitors were rare at the estate, rarer still without prior notice. She looked out in time to see a carriage painted in deep hunter green, its door marked with a gold crest she did not recognize. Jonathan met the caller in the entry hall. Elizabeth, from the doorway of the drawing room, saw a tall man step inside, rainwater dripping from his coat. He removed his hat and shook Jonathan's hand, speaking in a low, urgent tone. She caught only fragments. The girl, rightful inheritance, questions in the county. Before Jonathan's eyes flicked toward her, the look was not one of surprise, but of calculation. "Elizabeth," he said evenly, "return to your studies. I'll join you shortly." She obeyed, but left the drawing room door ajar just enough to catch the murmur of voices. The man's tone was sharper now, insistent. Jonathan's replies were smooth, almost amused. All under legal guardianship, nothing irregular. Yet her uncle's estate. A pause. Then Jonathan's voice, colder than she had ever heard it. "You will find your inquiries unwelcome here." When she next looked through the crack in the door, the man was already pulling on his gloves, his expression set but unsatisfied. He left without shaking Jonathan's hand a second time. That evening, Jonathan was uncharacteristically silent at dinner. He asked no questions about her lessons, made no small talk about the weather or the state of the roses. Instead, he studied her with that same measuring gaze, as though weighing whether she had heard more than she should. "Not everyone who comes to you is a friend," he said finally, breaking the quiet. "Some might cloak their greed in the language of concern. You must remember that." Elizabeth nodded, but something inside her twisted. The man had spoken of her inheritance, a word Jonathan had never once used in her presence. And if there was nothing to hide, why had the conversation ended with a threat? That night the rain stopped, and the air in the house seemed stiller than usual. As Elizabeth lay in bed, she thought of the green carriage vanishing down the muddy road, carrying with it the first hint that the world outside Mill Haven might not match the one Jonathan had built for her. Jonathan, she sensed, would not let such a breach happen twice. The very next morning, Jonathan's tone with the household shifted. Orders were given not as suggestions, but as commands. The footmen were told to bar unannounced callers from reaching the front door. Samuel Bigham, the overseer, was instructed to ride the boundary roads twice daily and report any loiterers. Miss Fenwick was informed, in Jonathan's polite but immovable way, that Elizabeth's lessons would now be held exclusively in the house, no more outings to the church or nearby farms for educational purposes. The governess accepted this with tight lips, but Elizabeth saw something pass in her eyes, resignation perhaps, or fear. 2 days later, a letter arrived addressed to her in an unfamiliar hand. She had barely broken the seal before Jonathan appeared in the doorway of the morning room. "May I?" he asked, though it was not a question. She handed it over. His eyes moved swiftly across the page, and then, without a word, he fed it into the small fire burning in the grate. The paper curled, blackened, and disappeared in a puff of smoke. "From the man in the green carriage," he said simply, "full of ideas that would unsettle you. I've spared you the trouble." Elizabeth's protest rose to her lips but stopped there. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the kind that dared her to doubt his judgment. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan filled her hours with tasks, copying estate ledgers, reading aloud from his chosen books, walking the grounds at his side to observe improvements. The rhythm of the days left no space for solitary thought. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he said, "You know, Elizabeth, the world is like a wild sea. Alone, you would be swept away. But with me, with us, you have an anchor. No tide can take you." She nodded, though in the quiet that followed she could still hear the faint echo of carriage wheels on wet road, carrying away the only man who had dared to speak of her inheritance. Jonathan Caldwell had drawn the circle tighter around her, and Elizabeth was beginning to realize that circles, no matter how gilded, were still cages. It was Miss Fenwick who broke the silence first. One grey afternoon, while Jonathan was away inspecting the far fields, the governess closed the atlas they had been studying and said quietly, "Elizabeth, have you ever seen the ocean?" Elizabeth shook her head. The question felt strange, almost dangerous, and Miss Fenwick's eyes flicked to the door before she continued. "There's a steamer line from Norfolk, 2 days' journey, and you could stand on the pier with nothing but water to the horizon." She paused, then added, "A person should know what the edge of the world looks like before someone else decides where their world begins and ends." Elizabeth's heart gave a small, startled leap. She wanted to ask more, but the sound of hooves on gravel cut her short. Miss Fenwick snapped the atlas open again, her voice brisk and factual by the time Jonathan entered the room. That night over dinner, Jonathan asked in an offhand way, "Did Miss Fenwick keep you industrious this afternoon?" His eyes never left her face. Elizabeth answered yes, but her pulse betrayed her. She could feel it hammering in her throat. Over the next week, small acts began to accumulate like pebbles at the bottom of a well. Miss Fenwick allowed her to keep certain books hidden under the mattress, novels full of distant cities and unchaperoned heroines. She gave Elizabeth sewing mending to do in the east window, where the hills rolled far beyond the estate's boundaries. And one evening, she pressed a small folded scrap into Elizabeth's hand while pretending to adjust her cuff. It was a map. Crude, sketched in pencil, but unmistakable. It showed the road from Millhaven to the river, and from there to the nearest post station. Elizabeth stared at it long after she was alone in her room. She felt a tremor of possibility, sharp and intoxicating, run through her, but she also knew Jonathan's reach. He had made the world outside feel like deep water, and herself like someone who had never learned to swim. Still, for the first time, she considered that the cage might have a door, and that someone inside was quietly turning the key. Jonathan Caldwell had the gift, or the curse, of noticing the smallest changes. A misplaced quill on his desk, a decanter refilled too soon, the faintest pause before an answer. In the days that followed, Elizabeth felt his gaze on her more often, as if he were cataloguing her expressions the way he once had catalogued the estate's ledgers. He would linger in doorways without speaking, watch her over the rim of his teacup, ask idle questions that seemed to probe for something beneath the surface. "You've been reading more in your room lately," he remarked one evening. "What keeps you so occupied up there?" She kept her voice steady. "French grammar, mostly." "Ah." He smiled, but it was not the smile of amusement. It was the smile of a chess player moving a pawn. Miss Fenwick, too, had grown tense. She spoke less, watched the hallways before stepping into them, and never stayed in the same room with Jonathan longer than politeness required. Elizabeth wondered whether Jonathan had already guessed that the governess was the crack in the wall. The first open sign came one afternoon when Elizabeth went to the library and found her map missing from its hiding place inside a book. In its place was a pressed rose, deep crimson, brittle with age. On the back of the stem in Jonathan's hand was a single word, pruned. Her blood went cold. That night at supper, Jonathan spoke only of estate matters, but his tone was threaded with something else, a quiet assertion that he knew exactly what currents ran beneath his roof. "Trust," he said, pouring her wine, "is a fragile thing, Elizabeth. Once broken, it can't be mended. Not truly. Best to keep it whole from the start." She sipped in silence, tasting the weight of the warning in every drop. The house seemed smaller after that. Doors felt heavier, shadows deeper. Every step she took was measured, every word sifted before she spoke. The map was gone, but the thought it had planted would not leave her. Jonathan might watch her every move, but he could not yet watch her thoughts. It began with a summons. Late in the morning, a maid appeared at the doorway to Elizabeth's chamber, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. "Mr. Caldwell wishes to see you in the study," she said, eyes fixed on the floor. Jonathan's study was a room she entered only when invited. The air inside was always faintly scented with pipe smoke and the leather of old bindings. Today, the curtains were drawn against the autumn light, leaving the room dim except for the glow from the fireplace. Jonathan stood by the mantel, hands folded behind his back. Across from him, in the straight-backed chair reserved for guests, sat Miss Fenwick. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable, though her fingers gripped the arms of the chair as if she were holding herself in place. "Elizabeth," Jonathan said softly, "come sit beside me." She obeyed, her pulse quickening. "I've been speaking with Miss Fenwick," he continued. "It seems there have been discrepancies. Lessons that were not in the curriculum, walks that led farther than intended, books appearing in your possession that I did not select." He turned to her with a faint smile that did not reach his eyes. "I thought it best to hear from you directly." Elizabeth's throat felt dry. I don't know what you mean." He took a slow step toward her, lowering his voice as if speaking to a confidant. "My dear, there's no shame in telling the truth. If Miss Fenwick has encouraged you to think in ways that are impractical, I will not blame you. I only need to know where your loyalties lie." Miss Fenwick's head tilted slightly, and in that small motion Elizabeth felt the weight of the choice pressing on her. She could see the resolve in the governess's eyes, but also the danger for both of them. Jonathan picked up a small object from his desk and held it out. It was the rose he had left in place of the Mai, its petals now crumbling at the edges. "This," he said, "was a warning. But I would prefer not to give warnings to those I care for." The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the fire. Elizabeth felt her mind split along two paths. One was safety, to agree with him, to let Miss Fenwick bear whatever consequence came. The other was a plunge into the unknown, to stand beside the only person who had offered her a glimpse beyond the estate walls. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though she could feel the tremor in her hands. "I have learned more from Miss Fenwick than I could have alone. If that is disloyalty, then I am guilty." Jonathan's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. Then he turned away and set the rose back on the desk. "Very well," he said at last. "We will speak again this evening. Alone." As she left the study, Elizabeth knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, the circle had been crossed, and there was no stepping back inside it. The evening conversation Jonathan promised never came. Instead, Elizabeth awoke the next morning to the sound of wheels on gravel. From her window she saw the small carriage usually reserved for errands and discreet departures. The trunk strapped to its rear was Miss Fenwick's. By the time Elizabeth reached the front steps, the governess was already inside, sitting stiff-backed, her gloved hands folded in her lap. Jonathan stood beside the carriage door, speaking in low tones to the driver. When he turned to Elizabeth, his smile was polite but final. "Miss Fenwick has decided to seek employment closer to her family. The air here, she feels, is not suited to her health." "That's not," Elizabeth began, but Jonathan's eyes sharpened and the rest of the sentence lodged in her throat. Miss Fenwick did not contradict him. She met Elizabeth's gaze only once, and in that brief look there was something, regret, warning, and perhaps the faintest flicker of hope. Then the carriage rolled away down the drive, the sound of its wheels fading into the morning fog. Inside, the house felt different. The halls were quieter, the air heavier. Jonathan's presence seemed to fill every space now. Even when she was alone, she could feel his shadow in the corners. Her lessons continued, but without Miss Fenwick, there was no subtle rebellion in them. Jonathan himself oversaw her studies some days, and on others, he replaced them entirely with practical instruction. The management of accounts, the reading of legal documents, the memorization of family histories. "You must understand," he told her one afternoon as they sat in the library, "I have only your best interests at heart. People will try to mislead you, to fill your head with dangerous notions. I have protected you from that, and I will continue to do so." But the word protected now sounded like another word entirely, assessed. In the absence of Miss Fenwick, Elizabeth began to think more about the map, the river road, the post station. She replayed in her mind every detail Miss Fenwick had given her in those stolen moments. The absence was painful, but it left a strange kind of space in which new resolve could grow. Jonathan may have closed one door, but he had not yet found the others. That night, lying awake in the darkness, Elizabeth thought of the green carriage that had come for her once, of the visitor who had spoken of her inheritance, of the way the world beyond the gates must smell after rain. Jonathan had taken her ally, but in doing so, he had made something else impossible to take away, her knowledge that escape was not only necessary, but inevitable. Elizabeth knew she could not run yet, not with Jonathan's eyes on her every hour, and not without the means to reach the world beyond the estate gates. But she also knew that waiting without acting was as dangerous as being caught in the act itself. She began with small things, changes so slight they would slip beneath notice. A pair of gloves placed in the drawer nearest her bed instead of in the wardrobe, a silver hairpin kept in the pocket of her walking dress rather than in its case. These were nothing on their own, but in her mind they became seeds of readiness. Jonathan had taken to inspecting her correspondence before it left the house. She never resisted, not outwardly, but she began to include harmless lines in her letters to distant cousins that could double as markers. "The orchard is heavy with pears this year," meant she was still safe. "The orchard seems thin this season," would mean she had left. She doubted her cousins would recognize the code, but she needed the comfort of planting it somewhere, anywhere, outside his reach. Her next step came from memory. Miss Fenwick had once told her in passing that the far paddock gate could be lifted off its hinges if one knew how to work the pins loose. Elizabeth began volunteering for tasks in that part of the estate, delivering ledgers to the stablemaster, counting feed sacks, even helping with the colts under the pretense of learning responsibility. Each time, she passed the gate, glancing at the iron pins until she knew their rusted heads by heart. Jonathan noticed her new diligence, and for once seemed pleased. "You're maturing," he said at supper, watching her over the silver rim of his glass. "I had feared Miss Fenwick's departure might leave you adrift, but you've found a better compass." She smiled faintly, lowering her eyes so he could not see the truth flicker there. On a rain-soaked Thursday, she found her first real opportunity. Jonathan had left for the northern tenant farms before dawn, and the steward, accustomed to Miss Fenwick's oversight, gave her more freedom than he realized. She walked the outer lanes of the property under the guise of checking on the dairy herd, and when no one was near, she tested the paddock gate. The pins shifted slightly under her touch, stiff but not immovable. Her heart raced. The sound of a distant bell from the main house sent her back quickly, but she carried the memory of that small give in the metal with her all day. That night she wrapped a few coins from her sewing purse in a handkerchief and hid them beneath the false bottom of her writing desk drawer. It was not much, barely enough for a meal and a night's lodging, but it was something. She told herself she would not act yet. She would wait for the right moment, but deep inside, she knew that moments did not present themselves. They had to be made. It began with the smallest of comments. "You've been outside more than usual," Jonathan remarked one morning over breakfast, his voice casual but his eyes fixed on her. "I trust the weather is treating you kindly?" Elizabeth gave the expected smile. "The air has been good for clearing my head." He said, and let the matter drop. But she felt the shift, like the faint tightening of a noose that had always been there. Over the next week, his presence became more constant. When she worked on accounts, he would stand behind her, watching each figure she wrote. When she went walking, a footman would accompany her for safety. Her letters now passed through Jonathan's hands twice, once before being written, when he inquired what she planned to say, and again after. One afternoon, she entered the library to find her desk drawer open. The handkerchief-wrapped coins were gone. In their place lay a sprig of rosemary, green, fragrant, freshly cut. A symbol she could not mistake, remembrance in the language of flowers, but also a warning. Jonathan appeared in the doorway moments later. "I took the liberty of tidying your writing space," he said mildly. "You keep the strangest little collections, Elizabeth. One wonders what they're for." She met his gaze without flinching. "We all keep tokens." His smile was slow, deliberate. "Yes. The difference lies in whether they keep us or bind us." After that, he began setting her new tasks, duties that kept her indoors and always within earshot of someone else. She was to review estate inventories, oversee the laundry accounts, and learn the finer points of correspondence with suppliers. A lady should know her household, he explained, and her household should know where to find her. Elizabeth realized what he was doing, shortening the leash. The paddock gate, the open lanes, the slivers of solitude she'd cultivated, all were being pruned away, just as he had pruned Miss Fenwick. It would have been easy to panic, but she forced herself to move more carefully, letting her routine become predictable again. If Jonathan was suspicious, she would give him a reason to relax. She began sewing in the evenings by the fire, humming softly, answering his questions with quiet obedience. When he suggested she should take fewer walks, she agreed at once. If he thought she had been testing her boundaries, he would now see them reinforced. But in her mind, she marked the days, the hours, the habits of the household staff. She noticed that the kitchen door was often propped open in the early morning to air the room, and that the stable boys took their breakfast just after first light, leaving the paddock momentarily unwatched. Jonathan's tightening control did not close every door. It only made her more certain that she had to find one before it shut for good. The opportunity came on a morning wrapped in mist. Jonathan had gone to meet the steward at the south pasture, and the house, though not empty, felt looser, as if the watchfulness had thinned with his absence. The kitchen door stood ajar to let the steam escape from the great copper pots, and the smell of baking bread drifted through the courtyard. Elizabeth carried a basket of folded linens, her pace unhurried, her expression composed. Anyone watching would think she was simply delivering them to the drying room, but instead of turning toward the laundry hall, she walked down the side path toward the stables. She had timed it carefully. The stable boys were at breakfast, their voices faint and muffled from the far end of the yard. The paddock gate stood in the same place it always had, the iron dark with dew. She set the basket down and ran her fingers over the hinge pins. They were stiff, but she remembered the give she'd felt before. She worked one loose with slow, careful pressure, every nerve braced for the sound of a bootstep behind her. The metal shifted, not much, but enough to prove that with more time she could free it completely. Her pulse raced. It was not escape yet, only proof that escape remained possible. She replaced the pin exactly as it had been and retrieved her basket just as a groom emerged from the stable, wiping his hands on his apron. "Need something, miss?" "Only passing through," she said lightly, adjusting the folds of linen. "The morning's too fine to waste indoors." He nodded without suspicion, and she walked away at a measured pace, resisting the urge to glance back. The rest of the day passed in a blur of tasks, checking the pantry inventory, mending a tear in one of Jonathan's waistcoats, answering the polite but probing questions he asked over supper. She answered each one smoothly, her mind holding to the image of the loosened hinge pin like a talisman. That night in her room, she lit no candle. She sat in the dark, listening to the slow settling of the house, the distant clink of cooling metal in the kitchen, the faint creak of floorboards as the servants retired, the quiet closing of Jonathan's study door. The hinge had moved. That was all that mattered. The way out existed, still hidden beneath his control, still hers to claim when the moment came. But she also knew something else. The more she tested, the greater the risk of discovery. Jonathan's patience was not infinite. If he caught even a whisper of what she was doing, he would close the paddock gate forever, perhaps in ways she could not yet imagine. And so she resolved to wait again. But this time, her waiting was not passive. It was the waiting of an arrow held taut in the bowstring, silent, unseen, ready to fly. It was late afternoon when the sound of carriage wheels carried through the courtyard. Elizabeth, seated in the drawing room with her embroidery, looked up to see a dark green landau pulling to a stop. The crest on the door was unfamiliar, a gold stag leaping over a crown. Jonathan's footsteps approached before she could rise. "A caller," he said, voice smooth. "An old acquaintance from the north. You'll join us, of course." The man who stepped down from the carriage was in his middle years, well-dressed but travel-worn, his boots dusted from the road. He greeted Jonathan with the kind of familiarity that spoke of shared history, then turned to Elizabeth with a courteous bow. "Mr. Ashton," Jonathan introduced, "visiting the district on business." Elizabeth curtsied. "Welcome to Caldwell House." During tea, the conversation flowed easily between the men. Politics, land prices, weather. But beneath the civility, Elizabeth felt a current of purpose in Jonathan's tone, as though the meeting was more than a casual reunion. It was when Mr. Ashton mentioned the post road to the coast that Elizabeth's pulse quickened. They say it's improved, he remarked. Fewer ruts, better drainage. A rider could make good time to the port now. Jonathan's gaze flicked to her, brief but sharp. We've no need for ports here, he said lightly. Everything we require is within the estate. Elizabeth lowered her eyes, pretending to be absorbed in adjusting her teacup, but inside she weighed the words carefully. If Mr. Ashton was travelling from the coast, then he knew the routes, perhaps even the inns and stations along the way. After tea, Jonathan suggested a tour of the estate. Elizabeth accompanied them, her steps measured, her face serene, but she was listening for any detail, any clue that might be useful. At the paddock, she caught a flicker of curiosity in Mr. Ashton's expression as he glanced at the fields. Fine land, he said, and you keep it well enclosed. Necessary, Jonathan replied. Strangers have no place here. Elizabeth's heart sank. The tone was not for Mr. Ashton. It was for her, a warning disguised as conversation. That evening, the visitor stayed for supper. Jonathan kept her close at the table, drawing her into harmless topics. The harvest, the weather, the music she'd been practicing, but she could feel his attention like a hand on her shoulder, holding her in place. When Mr. Ashton finally retired to the guest chamber, Jonathan lingered in the hall with her. You seemed interested in our guest's travels, he said. I only listened politely. Good. Curiosity in excess can be dangerous. He left her then, but she understood. The timing of her escape had grown more fragile. An unexpected visitor could be an ally or a trap, and Jonathan intended she never discover which. The next morning the air was damp with the scent of rain, and the house moved at a slower pace. Jonathan was in his study with the steward, leaving Elizabeth to oversee the breakfast service for their guest. Mr. Ashton entered the dining room with an easy smile, but his eyes lingered on her for a fraction longer than courtesy required. You keep a fine house, Miss Caldwell, he said, as he took his seat. Thank you, she replied, pouring his coffee. As she leaned forward, he spoke just above a whisper. You've not been to the coast, have you? Elizabeth's hand stilled on the pot. No, sir, she said evenly. A shame, he murmured, his tone still light enough to pass for idle talk. The road's good this time of year. If you ever go, ask for the Red Fox Inn. Tell them Ashton sent you. Before she could respond, the clink of a door latch sounded from the hall. Jonathan's voice drifted in, speaking to someone about grain shipments. Mr. Ashton lifted his cup and sipped, as if nothing had passed between them. Elizabeth finished serving without a flicker of expression, but the words burned in her mind. Red Fox Inn. It might be nothing. It might be everything. Later that morning, Jonathan suggested she show Mr. Ashton the conservatory while he attended to estate business. They walked among the warm glass walls, the scent of damp earth and citrus leaves surrounding them. I imagine you have little cause to leave here, Ashton said quietly when they reached the far corner, out of earshot of the gardener. Not much, she admitted. He gave her a sidelong glance. If ever you do, remember, the Red Fox has a back door onto a stable lane, no questions asked. Elizabeth's pulse quickened, but she kept her gaze on a pot of orange blossoms. You speak as if I travel alone, she said lightly. As if, he echoed with a faint, knowing smile, then louder. These blooms are extraordinary. I've not seen their like since Spain. When they returned to the main hall, Jonathan was waiting. He looked between them, just long enough to register the possibility of words exchanged, then said, Mr. Ashton, I hope Elizabeth has been a good guide. A perfect one, Ashton replied. Jonathan's smile didn't reach his eyes. Good. I find clarity in knowing precisely where everyone has been. Elizabeth excused herself soon after, her mind whirring. The Red Fox Inn could be a stepping stone, a place to vanish, a point beyond Jonathan's reach. But the risk was greater now. If Jonathan had even a suspicion about the conversation, he would tighten the walls again. That night, she dreamed of a back door onto a stable lane, and of the man who might have just given her the key. 2 days after Mr. Ashton's arrival, Jonathan announced the change over breakfast as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "You'll come with me to Hawthorne Manor this afternoon," he said, spooning sugar into his tea. "Lord and Lady Hawthorne are eager to see you again." Elizabeth's pulse quickened. Hawthorne Manor was 20 miles north, in the opposite direction of the coast, the opposite direction of the Red Fox Inn. The visit would keep her from her quiet afternoon walk to the paddock, the one she'd been counting on to make her next test. She set down her cup. "If you prefer, I could remain here to oversee our guests' comfort." Jonathan's gaze held hers for a long moment. "Mr. Ashton will be riding out to call on an associate. I doubt he'll require company." The words carried a weight she understood too well. He didn't want her alone with Ashton. The journey to Hawthorne Manor was uneventful, the carriage wheels humming over the rutted road. Jonathan made light conversation about estate matters, but Elizabeth knew he was watching her in the glass reflection. Testing. The Hawthorns greeted them warmly. Their home was bright, filled with the scent of beeswax and the laughter of visiting cousins. Elizabeth smiled, answered questions, accepted tea, but all the while her mind measured the cost of the lost opportunity at home. Jonathan stayed close, never letting her drift far from his side. It wasn't until they were leaving, standing in the sunlit entry hall, that Lady Hawthorne pressed a hand to Elizabeth's and said, "We'll be at the Port Festival next month. You must join us." Jonathan's smile tightened. "We rarely travel that far." "Pity," Lady Hawthorne said. "You'd love the market stalls." On the carriage ride home, Jonathan was silent. The countryside rolled by, fields fading into hedgerows. Finally he said, "You seemed interested in the mention of the port." Elizabeth kept her voice even. "I've never been. Curiosity is natural." His fingers tapped once on the carriage armrest. "Too much curiosity is dangerous." The echo of his earlier warning was deliberate. When they returned, dusk was settling. Mr. Ashton was not yet back from his own outing, but a stable hand was sweeping the yard. Jonathan sent her upstairs to change for dinner. In her room, Elizabeth sat at the dressing table, hands gripping the edge. He was tightening the schedule, altering her days at will, a subtle reminder that he could dismantle her plans without ever naming them. But the trip had given her something too, confirmation that he feared her contact with Ashton, feared it enough to interfere. That meant Ashton's knowledge was real. The Red Fox Inn was no idle name. It was a thread worth holding. She would have to move sooner than she thought, before Jonathan realized the test had failed, and she was still playing the game. On the morning of Ashton's departure, the house was filled with the muffled bustle of trunks being carried to the carriage. Jonathan oversaw everything from the front steps, issuing instructions to the footman with calm precision. Elizabeth stood in the hall, hands clasped, as if merely seeing a guest off. Inside, her thoughts darted like birds in a cage. This was her last chance to speak to Ashton without Jonathan's shadow at her back. When the final trunk was loaded, Ashton stepped inside to fetch his gloves. Finding her alone, he paused just long enough to glance toward the open doorway, where Jonathan was occupied with the driver. "I'll be stopping at the Red Fox tonight," he said in a voice no louder than the creak of leather as he pulled on a glove. "If you can reach it by midnight, you'll find a horse waiting." Elizabeth's breath caught. "Jonathan doesn't know the half of what I do," Ashton interrupted, his tone still mild as though discussing the weather. "But he suspects enough. If you mean to leave, it must be soon. He'll close the walls before long." Her pulse thundered. "Why help me?" He smiled faintly, eyes sharpening. "Because I've seen his kind before, and I know what becomes of the people who stay." Footsteps sounded in the gravel outside. Without another word, Ashton stepped back, bowing slightly as Jonathan entered the hall. "Elizabeth," Jonathan said, his voice warm but lined with steel, "say your goodbyes." She inclined her head, keeping her expression serene. "Safe travels, Mr. Ashton." "And to you, Miss Caldwell," Ashton replied, his gaze holding hers for a heartbeat longer than etiquette allowed. Then he was gone, the sound of the carriage wheels fading into the damp morning air. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jonathan was in unusually high spirits, discussing plans for improvements to the east pasture, but Elizabeth felt the clock ticking behind every moment. Midnight at the Red Fox, a horse waiting. Her window for freedom had narrowed to hours. She would have to slip past the locked doors, past the servants who might betray her to Jonathan without meaning to. She would have to reach the paddock gate, the one with the loosened hinge pin, without leaving any sign of her passing. At supper, she laughed at Jonathan's wry remarks, asked after the steward's family, and even played a short piece on the pianoforte. But her mind was elsewhere, tracing the route from her chamber to the yard, from the yard to the gate, from the gate to the dark road beyond. She could almost hear the hoofbeats already, not Jonathan's hunters chasing her, but her own mount carrying her away from Caldwell House. Tonight, the arrow would leave the bowstring, and if she missed, there would be no second shot. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 11. Elizabeth lay in bed fully dressed, her cloak folded beside her, boots already laced. She waited for the familiar sounds of the house settling, the faint creak of beams as the night air cooled them, the soft thud of a door closed by the last servant retiring. When all was still, she moved. Her chamber door opened without a sound. She had oiled the hinges 2 days ago under the pretense of spring cleaning. In the corridor, moonlight pooled on the carpet, showing her the way. She kept to the edges, where the boards were less likely to groan. Down the servants' stair, across the narrow passage behind the kitchen, the faint smell of banked embers clung to the air. She slipped through the scullery door into the yard. The night was damp, the mist clinging low to the ground. She could hear her own breath, quick and shallow. The paddock gate stood ahead, its shadow a darker line against the grass. She reached for the hinge pin and froze. A sound, the crunch of gravel under a boot. Jonathan's voice, low but clear, drifted from somewhere near the stables. "I told you to secure the gate every night." A stable hand mumbled a reply. Elizabeth pressed herself against the fence, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might be heard. The voices moved away toward the main yard. She counted to 30, then slid the pin free. The gate opened just enough for her to slip through. Beyond lay the dark road. The mist thickened, muffling her footsteps. She walked quickly at first, then broke into a run, the Red Fox Inn pulling at her like a lodestar. An owl called somewhere in the hedgerow. Far off, she thought she heard hoofbeats, not from ahead but behind. She dared not look. The road curved, and the inn's lantern came into view, a faint golden glow in the fog. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, but she pushed on until she reached the stable yard. A single horse waited, saddled and tethered, just as Ashton had promised. She swung into the saddle, her skirts bunching awkwardly, and urged the animal forward. Behind her, the hoofbeats grew louder. She didn't stop. The lane opened into the main road to the coast, and the horse surged ahead, its breath steaming in the cold air. The sound behind her faded, then was gone. She didn't know if it was pursuit abandoned or only delayed, and she didn't care. The mist thinned as they rode. Ahead, she could just see the first faint blush of dawn over the horizon. Elizabeth did not look back. By the time the sun rose over the coast, she would be gone from Caldwell House forever, and whatever Jonathan might say of her absence, it would be spoken to empty rooms. By mid-morning, the Red Fox Inn had no sign she had ever been there, no name in the guest book, no trace in the stable, but a few hoofprints in the yard. Elizabeth rode south until the sea opened before her, its wide horizon gleaming like a promise. In the small port town, she traded the horse for passage on a merchant vessel bound for Lisbon. Her name changed to one the captain never questioned. As the ship slipped away from the shore, she stood at the rail, the wind catching her hair, watching England recede into a line of grey. Behind her lay the shadowed corridors of Caldwell House and Jonathan's tightening grip. Ahead lay cities where no one knew her face. She did not know what waited for her in that wider world, only that it would be hers to choose, and for the first time in years the choice was freedom.